All right, so this is the 5th class. Sorry, I think it's the 6th class in climate change. Could you mute your mics? And today we're actually going to talk about the topic of climate change. So we prefaced this with a lot of information from earlier classes, namely the Earth climate, how it should be, the greenhouse effect, and the cycling of carbon and nitrogen in the air. So now it's time to talk about the problem of climate change, what it is looking like for the future, and some of the consequences. So what happens if we don't do anything? So here goes. So as you know, we've been talking about Milankovitch cycles. So the climate of the Earth had always been changing. It is still changing today. So climate change is not a new concept. It is supposed to change, okay? Now the issue is just that recently it's been changing or warming up faster than ever before. So it is not the fact that climate is changing that is concerning. It is the rate at which it is changing. And so there is a significant warming trend currently, as indicated in the diagram. On the y-axis, you have temperature. On the x-axis, you have time. So you can see that in recent years, after the 1970s, there's a huge trajectory upwards. All right, and the temperature for the past 12 years have been the warmest ever. So very often now we break the record for, like, say, hottest January ever, and then a few years later we break that record. So here's a map of climate projection and how different regions will warm in response to climate change. So as you can see, the dark red means a temperature increase of 1.6 to 2, whereas blue colors mean temperature drop. Most of the map is orange, yellow, or red. Okay, very few specific regions where it actually drops. So there is a clear trend. Clearly, the Earth is warming up everywhere on the surface. And it is worse near the poles. The North Pole, the Northern Hemisphere, a lot of part of Russia and the Middle East, they're really red. So they're most affected because of the albedo effect. That is where we have most amount of ice and snow. So if they were to melt, they have another warming effect on the climate in addition to greenhouse gases. All right, so a climate projection is a computer model that scientists use to predict what will happen to future climates, because we need to make predictions so we can change our behavior and change our economy in preparations for what's to come. All right, so these climate models use satellites from all over the globe. They try to monitor weather data, and they use computer models to basically simulate what will happen if you have certain conditions. All right, and the climate models all predict that it is definitely going to warm. It is the matter of how much it is going to warm. So we have roughly two scenarios. In red, you have scenario A. That is, we basically just carrying on with our lives. We continue our dependence on fossil fuels. So that means no regulations on extraction of fossil fuel. We still use gasoline cars. We use coal, natural gas to heat our homes. So life as you know it. Then by the end of the century, the temperature is probably going to rise by more than 4 degrees. Okay, that is catastrophic. Now, we don't want that. We want to, flatten the curve. That sounds ironic right now, but yes. We want situation B. So that is when we switch to clean energy sources and conserve energy. So we develop alternative sources of renewable energies. like solar, electric, clean ways to generate electricity, nuclear even. So if we end our dependence on fossil fuels, it is still going to cause an increase in the climate, okay? The Earth is going to warm, whether we like it or not. There's nothing we can do to stop that. It is like the coronavirus. There's nothing we can do to stop it. But doesn't mean we don't do anything. It just means we try our best to make sure that it is not that bad. We try our best to make sure that the consequences aren't as devastating. So if the planet is going to warm, don't let it warm too much. So if we put everything together, if we all work together in this, hopefully we can limit the amount of warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius like the diagram suggests. Okay, so that's why we need to take action now, not to stop climate change, but to slow it down. And some of the ways that we can do that, well, that's clean energy. So these 6 are sources of renewables that we're currently looking into. Now, obviously, they have their flaws. None of these are perfect. That's why the world is not dependent on these energy sources. We're dependent on fossil fuels. None of them can actually replace fossil fuels right now. But more reason to invest more money into these technologies. So if you want to invest money in fossil fuels, like now, if you want to invest in fracking, digging more coal, that is not a sustainable approach. The future will leave you behind. So we need to invest money in green technology. So there has been a great surge in the amount of investments in these green technologies, with Europe and China taking the lead. America had, well, they decided to step back and go back into coal and fracking. So these technologies, albeit with flaws, they're extremely important in our supply of energy. All right, so even if we stop cold turkey today, let's say the fossil fuel industry disappears overnight and everyone stops driving, we don't heat our homes with gas anymore, well, the climate will still get warmer. All right, so we will continue to warm for to the end of the century because we have already emitted the greenhouse gases. They are already there. They are taking effect. They are already warming the planet. Stopping it, well, it won't entirely stop the warming. Okay, it will slow the warming, but not stop. As you can see in the pie chart, we use a lot of fossil fuels like oil, natural gas, and coal, the 3 biggest pieces to that pie. Nuclear, hydro, and renewables, those are pathetic. They add up to like 13%. Right, so we need to make those areas bigger while limiting the amount of fossil fuels. So we do need to switch quickly, right, so we can avert the most serious consequences. All right, so what are the consequences of climate change? So why should you care, right? Like if Indonesia has a flood, well, you're not in Indonesia, you don't have any family or relatives, so who cares? If Fiji has the sea level rise on them, okay. So if India has lots of droughts or floods, again, you're not in India. So here's why we should all care. Hold on. Yeah, for the students coming in late, you really have no reason. So you're disrupting the class for me to admit you. All right, so glaciers have been decreasing in size, right? Especially in the South Pole. The South Pole is slowly melting. The sea ice that is surrounding the continent, so South Pole is a continent, Antarctica. Okay, that's a landmass. But around that, you have sea ice, frozen seawater. Now, if that were to melt, you will increase the amount of water that is in the ocean instead of being ice. So snow is melting way more inland, not just in the sea now. And more ice is melting, and higher latitudes are being melted. So here's a diagram. I've shown you this before to compare summers in 1979 versus 2007. This is still an old infographic. This is more than 10 years old. So you can imagine how little ice we have now. So that's quickly disappearing. Right, so the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's their official that's the official thing for climate change. So basically, this is an intergovernmental organization with a bunch of scientists. They come together to come up with ideas on how we can fight this global disaster. So 4 major impacts have been identified. The number one impact is rising sea levels. I kind of briefly touched on that. And then there will be impacts on agriculture. Well, if you change the climate, you change the agricultural patterns. It will have an effect on the ecosystem, okay, because organisms are adapted to the climate they find themselves in. If you were to change that, they will likely fail to adapt and die. And then lastly, there will be effects on human, plant, and animal health. If you don't care about the rest of them, well, you should. Well, the last one should really alarm you because you're a human. So starting with sea level rise. Now, what's the problem? If ice sheets and glacier in the Arctic or the Antarctic, if they melt, you increase the amount of water in the ocean. And if you do that, the ocean will rise. Okay? So, well, coastal cities will then be flooded. We're not talking about just some remote islands in the Pacific, although people do live there. We're talking about the coastlines of basically all of the countries in the world. So in the past 120 years, it has already risen. In Miami, Florida, they are constantly combating sea level rise. They have to build the city higher and higher because the ocean levels are rising higher and higher. And throughout history, humans have chosen to settle near water. Where there's water, there's humans. All right, so just think about the large cities. Most of them are near a river or a lake. Okay, Los Angeles, New York, Miami, and British Columbia, Vancouver, right? Toronto is near a lake. Okay, so that doesn't really matter. So many cities in Europe, Asia, all over the world, those coastal cities, the richest ones, they will be significantly affected. That will displace billions of people. So if your city is flooded, you gotta pick up your home and move it somewhere else. All right, so some countries have it bad. Like Bangladesh and the Netherlands have it especially bad because those countries are low-lying countries. Their altitudes are at or below sea level, right? So especially the Netherlands, it is a lowland. So they will actually lose landmass and that will become submerged underwater. So not just developing countries will be affected. Even rich, developed countries will also be affected. All right, so to make matters worse, when ice melts, sure, it becomes water, it causes sea level to rise. We understand that. But there's something called thermal expansion. All right? When you heat something, it expands. All right? If you ever try that with air, you see exactly what I'm talking about. You heat air, that will expand. Same thing with water. It doesn't expand to the same extent as air. But nevertheless, water will expand when you heat it. So if you increase the global temperature, you are essentially heating the oceans. So not only are you melting the ice to raise the sea level, thermal expansion will also increase the volume of the ocean, causing sea levels to rise even more. So this is twice as bad. All right, so if you look at the permanent ice covers in Greenland in the summer, orange means you've melted. And look at the amount of melting that occurs throughout the years. We have less and less ice cover in the summer. So that is the issue of sea level rise. That is one of the biggest issues that affects billions of people directly. All right, if you move on to the next one, severe weather patterns. Climate change doesn't simply mean you get warmer. Well, you do get warmer in many places. This also comes with severe weather events. Okay, heat, like heat waves, severe drought that ravages the land. If you don't have enough water, drier areas will become drier as the climate increases. So this will make it worse for them. And some places, the storms will become more intense. So there will be a lot of hurricanes and floods. All right, so usually those places already have a lot of hurricanes and floods. So this makes matters worse for everybody. Drier places get drier, wet places get even wetter. And so in the northern hemisphere, more precipitation will fall as rain instead of snow, because if the temperature warms, there will be less snow, but no, precipitation still falls, so you get more rain, more water, so more flooding. All right, so precipitation increases in northern Canada, but in the south, where it is already hot, they will become even drier. More water evaporates, and worse off for everybody. So you can see that just using your experience in recent years, there have been more severe weather days, more extremely hot heat waves in the summer, and some really cold stretches in the winter. So climate change doesn't simply mean you get hot, you change the ocean pattern, so you could become colder as well. And when it comes to agriculture, well, farming relies on rainfall and the sun. So if you get less rain in some parts of the world, you are unable to grow crops. So Africa is especially affected. Africa is already bad enough when it comes to agriculture. The climate change will make it even worse. So there will be less food produced. Not just Africa, all over the world, when it gets hotter and drier, drought will kill a lot of crops. Right? So if you produce less food, we will have more deaths. So that will be a massive famine. All right. So like I said before, warmer regions, wetter regions will have more rainfall. You still can't have that for crops. If you have a flood, you flood all your crops, that's just as bad as a drought. Okay, so these will severely damage our crop yields. All right, so far we have rising sea levels that would displace home and destroy cities. We have damage to agriculture, severe weather patterns. What else can go wrong? Well, you can screw up the seasons. So frequency of cold days have been decreasing. We still complain about cold winters because this is Toronto, we're near the Arctic. But in many other places, frequency of cold days are decreasing, frequency of hot days are increasing. Now, also, cold days come later in the year, and spring comes early, okay, because of the warmer temperature. Now that matters to plants and animals. You might want spring to come early because, well, I do, but the ecosystem is adapted to a specific date for spring to slowly start to begin. Plants will time their flowering in spring, okay? Some animals will mate in spring because flowers come out. If springs come earlier, you are forcing the flowers to basically blossom earlier. This will be a disconnect between the flowers and the insects. And there might be competition among flowers that they've never met before because they flower and blossom at different times. Not only that, animals will start to breed earlier. So this drastically changes the ecosystem, and there will be ramifications down the food chain. All right. And if you get warmer, animals will start to migrate north. Because if it gets warmer, north will become warmer. So those become hospitable homes for these organisms. And that's bad for humans and the ecosystem because you have problems such as invasive species. We've learned about invasive species in grade 9. Species that aren't supposed to be there. They're not native to that region. If you bring them over, they're going to cause a lot of problems. They're going to be competing with other animals there. They're going to be just wreaking havoc because they don't have natural predators. Nobody is there to check their numbers. So insects will migrate north to where we are. Like Canada is a cold place. We don't have a lot of mosquitoes, so we don't have a malaria problem. Africa does. Now, Europe doesn't. So if it gets warmer in Europe and North America, we will see more mosquitoes. We will see other bugs and insects that carry disease into our latitude. An example of this will be the mountain pine beetle. If you wonder what that picture is, this is a beetle that feeds on trees. Normally, it is too cold for the beetle to survive in Canada, but since climate has been changing, this beetle is finding itself more and more comfortable in British Columbia. So if the temperature goes up, we will see more infestations like this. All right, so more impact on the ecosystem. If they migrate to the poles, you have this drastic shift in habitats and animal distribution around the world. So we have to restructure our economy. For the animals on their end, many of these species won't survive and adapt. If you fail to adapt, you die. That's the law of nature. So scientists, the IPCC, have estimated that about 30% of all species on Earth will become extinct by 2050. If you think back to one of the greatest extinctions in Earth history, there are 5 of them. One of them killed off the dinosaurs. If you look at the statistics, most of them, around 70% of species died. And that's a major extinction event on the scale of geologic proportions. Over billions of years, only 5 of them happened. We're experiencing the 6th extinction, and we're causing it. 30% is a huge number. Okay? If you lose 30% of all species, that should be classified as a major extinction. And say goodbye to the corals. They will become extinct. There's really no question about that. Natural coral will not be a thing by 2050. These are really sensitive aquatic ecosystems. They need the ocean temperature to stay the same. They need the ocean salinity to stay the same. They need the pH to stay the same. If there is just a 1 degree Celsius rise, they will not adapt and they will die. And guess what? We have already confirmed that there will indeed be at least 1 degree rise in the temperature. Nothing we can do will stop that. So it is all but certain that coral will become extinct, which is really sad. When I was in university, I took a course called Climate Change, and the professor was, well, he was pessimistic, but then he was ranting. He was like, if we don't do anything now, if the governments don't act now, we will not have coral in the future. He's speaking in a tone that tells us we can still do something about it. Okay, we need to feel a sense of urgency. Well, unfortunately, a few years later, I've become a teacher, and I'm teaching this now. I'm straight up telling you, yep, GG, it's too late. We can still do things. It's just that we will definitely feel some negative consequences, and this is one of them. Okay, so if you learn ecology, if you remove one member of the food web, you affect all the other members of the food web. And we're not just removing one species. We're removing 30% of all species. So you can imagine the catastrophe that will result in the ecosystem and perhaps lead to even more deaths. So that's the impacts on ecosystems. So finally, moving on to the most relevant to our daily lives, health. As I mentioned before, animals carry disease. Okay, pests carry disease like rats, insects, like mosquitoes, bacteria. They are carried usually with a vector. Okay, a vector is a carrier of that germ, and they live in specific habitats. If they were to migrate more northward, we get it. Okay, so malaria, dengue, fever, which are regions confined to mostly Asia and Africa, well, we're going to see them in Europe and North America because of climate change, and this will definitely have severe health impacts. I don't need to say more about that. People will die. All right, and the Arctic has it especially bad because of the albedo effect. We've learned about positive feedback. If ice and snow melts, you will reduce the albedo. That means you reflect less sunlight. If you reflect less sunlight, it means you absorb more sunlight. You heat up the air, which melts more snow. So this is a self-reassuring process. This will roll on and on and on until more and more and more ice melts. And this accelerates climate change in the poles. Okay, so polar bears have it pretty bad because polar bears need to live on ice. They can't live in the water. If they have less ice, they have less room to hunt, they have less room to breed, so they are at risk of extinction as well. The permafrost that are found in northern Canada in the tundra, the indigenous population mostly live on permafrost. The Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Yukon, those are basically built on permafrost. Permafrost, forever frozen, okay, that's fine. But if they start melting, and they are, you will cause things like sinkholes in the ground, because if your ground is melting, the structure that was built on top of it will collapse. So that really threatens the integrity of the land you literally live on. Okay, so a lot of people, well, not a lot, or some people, Canadians specifically, think climate change is a good thing. There are positive annotations, so positive connotations to climate change for Canada, because we can use a warmer climate, we can use more fertile land. Well, we're not looking at the whole picture. All right, so the problem of climate change lies in the fact that it is so fast. All right, so the greenhouse gas levels have been all-time high in the past 800,000 years. Now, the global temperature is projected right now to rise between 2 and 6. Now, this uncertainty between 2 and 6, it depends on our actions. If we all buckle down and bite the bullet as a planet, at Earthlings, we all put politics and race aside and start to combat this threat to our survival, like collectively, yeah, we can manage to make the temperature rise around 2, okay? But if we all basically treat this as a political game, we all care about our pockets and not so much the climate, and we all pass the buck, or is that even a saying? If we all just point fingers and try to, outsource this to some other country, well, if China is not doing it, why should I do it? They're emitting the most amount of CO2. If the U.S. withdrew from Paris, why should I do it? If China and the U.S. are not doing it, what difference does it make if I abide to the regulations? If people started thinking like that, everyone else litters, so why should I have to walk to the garbage can? So if everyone thinks like that, we're all screwed. So we all have to do our part. It's just like the coronavirus. If that guy is walking outside, why can't I go? If everybody thought that way, we'd be all on the street, and this would be a huge problem. So it all depends on what we do about it. All right, so why is this worrying? So why should a rise of 2 to 6 degrees scare us? Well, this is happening at record pace. Right? This is happening way too fast compared to the past. And this is higher than anything we've seen in the past 800,000 years. So not only is it the highest, it is increasing at an ever fast rate. And guess what? We've established our civilization on the current climate. If you were to change that, that would be problematic. All right, so what is the world doing? Basically this. Okay, so we've had many conferences on climate change, and they've all ended in like basically arguments and finger pointing. Well, you should have done this. Well, you should have done that. Okay, fine, I'll do this if you do that. Like, it's basically, they're arguing over like how little they should do. And even if a country is really dedicated into climate change, they're like, you know what, we're going to bite the bullet and do this. Well, governments don't last forever. The next election they lose, another guy comes in and just undoes all of the things that you've tried to do for the climate. So yeah, so far we're just running, but we're not moving forward. We're running in the same place. And if the world can all step up and do what we've been doing for the coronavirus, then yeah, no more politics, no more partisanship. Notice that the liberals and the conservatives, they don't fight over policies over the coronavirus. Liberals say shut down, sure, do it. There is no debate, there's no arguments, there is no finger pointing. If anything, they're telling each other, you're not doing enough. So if we can get that for climate change, unfortunately we don't have it, the conservative-leaning politicians, I'm not trying to make this politics, but yeah, like if you read the news, they're the ones less likely to do anything about climate change. So somehow politicians make this a political issue. This is not a political issue. This is a scientific issue. And in science, there's always a right answer. Facts don't change, okay, whether you like it or not. All right, so that's the problems that we're dealing with when it comes to climate change. So in summary, it's going to rise. The temperature will rise by at least 2 degrees. We're hoping to limit that as much as we can. Okay, the higher it rises, the more damage it will do. So that's why we need to really have a sense of urgency. How will that screw us over? Well, it will melt the ice caps. It will increase the sea level, which floods coastal cities. It will change weather patterns, more floods and more droughts, which affects agriculture. We'll have a reduced food income in the near future, which causes many famine and deaths. And also we will disrupt the ecosystem, causing around 30% of all organisms to go extinct. And lastly, diseases will migrate northward and find new habitats to infect more people. So in summary, we better do something about this. We have to limit our temperature increase to no more than 2 degrees. Otherwise, we're screwed. Okay? How do we do that? We need to limit greenhouse gas concentration. We need to stabilize it at 450 parts per million. It is currently at 400. We are hitting closer and closer to that mark. And yet we're not making much progress on climate change. Actually, this year, I think the countries might just meet their target because we shut down the economy. But it shouldn't have to take a virus for us to realize that. All right, so that's it for the lesson, folks. Do we have any questions? Well, really? Okay. If I'm not hearing questions, I haven't received the homework from everybody. I need everyone to email me your homework. Okay, I need that today.
Which homework?
All of them for climate change, the past 5.
Wait, so I put them online, so can I just take pictures, put them in a doc, and then share the doc with you?
Yes, that would be great. I don't know where you posted it. I checked Google Classroom before class. I don't see anything. Some of you have already done so. I saw your emails. Thank you. I expect the rest of you to follow suit. All right, and yeah, there's homework for this one as well. Starting next week, we will have classes every day. Okay, it won't be Monday, Wednesday, and Friday anymore. Same time next week, we'll talk about what we can do to fight climate change. And I'm splitting that into 3 different lessons. I'll first talk about the global scale, and then what countries can do, and then finally what you can do as an individual. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording.